here's like people that he was trying to get them within our deadline. Especially if they want a lot more information. I'm all busy and that's your team.
But enjoy it. All right, we're gonna get started. I'm obviously not Jason Delworm. I think he's in Italy, supposedly working, but I think he's actually somewhere. But I'm really excited to introduce Elliott Montgomery, who's from the Parsons School of Design, which is now part of the New School,
yes.
I believe.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell people about the New School. They have sort of an interesting new sort of take on
sure, yeah.
schooling too.
Yeah.
But I'll just maybe read a brief kind of introduction about Elliott. So he's a researcher and strategic designer whose work focuses on speculative alternatives at the confluence of social, technological, and environmental developments. He's the co-founder of the Extrapolation Factory, which I'm sure he'll talk about, which is a design-led featuring studio based in Brooklyn. He's also practiced as a design consultant for clients such as the New York City Department of Education, Autodesk, and I'll show my age. When I was a drafting student in high school, we used Autodesk 2 when they just had drafting software. They've come a long way since then.
They've come a long way.
Yeah. He's also exhibited his work at MoMA, the Shanghai Power Station of Art, and a bunch of other places. And also interesting, he was a former design research resident at the U.S. Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency,
yes.
which I'd love to hear some more about. And I'll just let Elliott take over to maybe sort of explain, or I think it'll become clear, sort of why we brought him here
sure.
to talk to you guys and how sort of design and science and art actually are all sort of merged together. So.
Yeah. Super. All right. Thanks for having me. So I normally speak to communities of designers, sometimes designer artist folks. So the work that I'm going to show today is coming from that perspective, and some of these slides are geared toward those communities. So I'll be interested to see how this lands. I have a feeling that you guys are probably in some cases more creative than some of the designers that I've talked to. So I'm excited for our conversations today. As was just mentioned, I teach at Parsons, which is part of the New School. The New School's been around since the early 1900s and has this history of kind of social innovation and social justice, thinking about how we focus our pursuits, our research to better humanity. Parsons, as it was brought under the umbrella of the New School, has really started to focus in those areas as well. So we do a lot of design for social innovation at Parsons. The work that I've been doing for the last 10 odd years or so is focused on this notion of design as a pathway to understanding some of the really critical challenges that we face as Earthlings today. I think there are certain cases where design can step into a context and offer a solution. If my legs are getting tired, we can design a chair and I can sit down. That's great. But there are a lot of scenarios such as the debates over genetic engineering, modification, synthetic biology, issues having to do with race bias or climate change. Any of these really troubling and thorny problems that are not going to be solved with a gesture as simple as the design of a chair, maybe moments where we really need more thorough conversation, and we certainly need more thorough conversation, and it's happening, but these might be opportunities where designers can step in and offer something to enable other parts of these conversations to take place. And so that's where I've been focusing my energy. So thinking about design as a tool for investigating implications as opposed to applications purely. I oftentimes start out my talks with this diagram, which comes from, I guess, a metaphor to the world of light physics. This was appropriated by, I think, Clem Bezold in the early 90s as a way to talk about the passage of time and the notion that as we tell ourselves stories about futures, possible fictional narratives that we could live into, that we could work toward, we can separate them out into these, this array of possibilities and non-possibilities. This is illustrated here in these somewhat clear terms, these hard lines between the impossible and possible. I think at the end of the day, this is much more blurry and it's very subjective. So for one person, the possible might feel, really within reach. Another person, the same idea might feel like it's absolutely in the impossible. To build on this, some of the work that I've been doing, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in the talk today, is focused on how we can start to democratize the process of telling stories about futures, building these narratives. We live in a world where a lot of the narratives about the future are coming from think tanks and kind of high-level politicians, putting very visual futures in our minds, things like walls, etc. We also live in a world where Hollywood provides a lot of narratives for futures. And so when I conduct workshops, even with young kids, and ask them to tell me kind of off the top of their heads what they think the future is going to look like, the first thing they always say is flying cars, right? And so we have these colonized pieces of future narratives that stick with us. And some of the work that I've been doing that's inspired by my position at the New School is to break away from these colonized future narratives and start to look for these more unique and personalized and culturally appropriate connected narratives of the future that we can use as milestones and guide points as we develop our plans for ourselves, our communities, and our society. So this is a diagram that is coming from a perspective in the art and design space, and it'll be interesting to hear how this resonates for some of you folks. There's a world of future studies that operates in some ways in a disconnected way from design. There's a world of speculative design that's emerging, that's starting to form its own territory. There's of course design, which is very amorphous, but we can start to pin down what we think it might be. Art feels like this other really kind of omnivorous territory, as Cameron Tonkin-Wise says. And then there are a few other overlapping territories. And so the work that I'm going to show today sits within a few of these spaces. A lot of the work ends up sitting around here in design futures, but probably most of it's going to be somewhere in that speculative design territory. As I've noted on the diagram, this is an evolving image, and it's kind of a starting point for conversations about the theoretical notion of what we're trying to do with some of the work that we're doing in this design space, where we move away from solution states and think more about the conversations. So I'm going to show a few examples of projects that are starting to get into these territories. This first one is by a designer named Michael Burton, and this was done in, I guess, late 2000s. Michael was really interested in this notion that there were a number of companies that were starting to look at ways that we could harvest from the body, maybe harvesting stem cells or harvesting other monetizable elements from the human, and started to think about how this might trickle down into the mainstream, how this might trickle into kind of day-to-day lives of folks who really just want to make a couple bucks. And so he started to imagine ways that we might augment our bodies slightly to produce these various materials from our body. Maybe we can start to harvest the tough tissue from the bottom of our feet, and then in some ways modify ourselves to grow more of that tissue. Maybe it becomes valuable. This is a project by Sasha Poflep and Daisy Ginsberg. I'm guessing that a few of you guys may have seen some of Daisy's work in the past, and maybe Sasha's as well. This was a project where they started to imagine how we might design kind of fruits or plants to create these very functional components that we could pluck off of plants and piece together to create artifacts almost right off of the vine. And so here you can see they've kind of imagined in a very fanciful way, but kind of referencing some botanical drawing aesthetic, these fictional plants, and then they've put them together in a way that creates this insecticide spray gun of sorts. So it's kind of bringing it back to this space. And I think in each of these cases, we can certainly say that this feels pretty far out, and maybe this is not even something that we would want to do, but by bringing these into a space where we can see them and imagine what it would be like to be there, we start to reframe the conversation that we might be able to have. This is another one by Daisy Ginsberg. I like this one because she's kind of taking one proposition and twisting it in two different ways. Here she's suggesting that we might use biosensors to sense toxins or pathogens around us. And so this device on the left would be this contained biosensor. It's I think a carbon monoxide sensor of sorts. Maybe it changes color as it senses the carbon monoxide in the air. And then the image on the right is some kind of biological reference tool. This is an example where this biosensor has escaped from this device and it's infected someone's lungs, and this is what was taken out of that person's lungs. So these are kind of demonstrative prototypes, but they allow us to start to think about the intended and the unintended, and she took this narrative and carried it through in a number of other cases. And then this last one by Daisy, which I'm guessing some of you guys have seen before. How many folks have seen this already? Okay, not too many actually. This is one of the earlier projects that she did in collaboration with a group of researchers. I think this was done with some synthetic biology students at the Cambridge iGEM team, or with the Cambridge iGEM team. They were looking at ways that we might be able to use biosensors which would change color to do things like help us understand what's happening in our own bodies. And so she suggested that if we seeded these biosensors in our guts, kind of built these like E. coli, variants into our gut microbiome, we might be able to look at our poo on the regular and start to get a sense of what was happening in our body. So if we had a purple one morning, we would say, oh wow, this is not normal, something's happening. This is already a relationship we have with our own bodies, and she's suggesting that through synthetic biology in the future we might be able to take this to a more sophisticated level. This is a project by Dunn and Raby. This project is interesting because they're not necessarily proposing a future per se, but rather talking about the work that's happening today to think about how it might transform our everyday experiences. So they designed these blank slate dolls, and they used them as conversation tools. They sat down with a number of young women in London who were on the dating scene, and they asked them what they might think of using synthetic biology or maybe genome testing playing into their dating rituals. Would you want to test a particular mate? Would you want to have their genome scanned, or would you be interested in knowing more about them if you could? And so they then had these folks kind of draw on these dolls their reactions to these conversations, and then captured the stories as short narratives. This is a project by a designer named J. Paul Neely, who works in a way that might be kind of very parallel to like a hoax or something like that. I think at the end of the day, his interest is in starting conversations, but he enters this space in a very formal manner and presents himself as being a researcher of sorts, or maybe a corporate representative. In this case, he is pitching a new company called the Gaia Corporation that has the rights to all of the genomes on Earth, or all genetic information. So the intellectual property is essentially kind of maintained by the Gaia Corporation, This comes from some of the conversations that are being had over whether we can patent genetic information. And so he presents this idea that the Gaia Corporation holds this stuff in an altruistic manner, and then as certain companies want to work with certain pieces of genomes, they're able to license it for short amounts of time. And he goes through a scenario where he talks about Nike licensing the tapeworm as a way to sell a new product where you would ingest this tapeworm, and then when you excrete it, you're able to look at your biometric data in a new way. It's like the next Fitbit 2.0. Moving away from genetic or modification, but moving into other interesting research territories. This is a project by Diego Trujillo, in which he was looking at how life might change as we start to cohabit with simple robotics. And so this is a scenario where we might have robots in our homes that are doing mundane daily tasks. So, you know, helping us to prepare dinner. In this case, the robot has this very meticulous kind of chopping process where it's chopping this like grid pattern on the steak. And you can see the chopping block here actually has these places where the robot can grab onto it because it maybe for whatever reason can't hold a normal chopping block. The package of meat there has some kind of QR code. And then here he's laid out the table. The robot has set the table for us, which is lovely. There are QR codes on the table, and there's a little, the same fitting on the side of the plate, but the robot has incorrectly set the table because it's not perpendicular to the chair. So these subtle moments in our relationships with technologies that are coming out into the world are explored through this kind of aesthetic interpretation of what it might be like. This is a piece of work by Orrin Katz. Do you guys know his work? He's a relatively controversial figure. I think he sometimes positions himself as a researcher, sometimes as an artist. This was a project that he did called Victimless Leather, where he created a scaffold and then grew a cell structure that came a cow onto this scaffold in the shape of a little jacket. So this is very tiny, very tiny. This was at the MoMA during an exhibition in 2007, 2008, something like that. And when the exhibition went up, partway through the show, there was a catastrophe, and it was reported that the victimless leather was escaping from this container, and they had to shut it down. And I've heard in the smaller design community that maybe this was actually a stunt that was intentionally set up by Orrin Katz. I'm not sure about that. But I think both the concept of proposing this almost ridiculous-looking victimless leather jacket, and then kind of setting it up in this very public place, and then having to shut it down. All of these pieces go to shaping some interesting conversations about our fear of these areas of research that really may be not as threatening as we might think they are. So this is a graph of the rise of natural disasters, and this was an inspiration for a project that I did a few years back. I'm guessing that this probably looks, or this type of data looks pretty familiar to you guys. There were a couple of researchers at King's College London who started to build correlations between the number of natural disasters that are happening around the world and the rate of depression in populations that are experiencing these disasters. And they put out a paper that in some way kind of challenged the IPCC to really start to think about other tertiary impacts of climate change, global warming, etc. I think they were very interested in moving away from some of the conversations around flooding and talking about these things that maybe don't get addressed as much. And so I had an opportunity to meet and get to know one of the two researchers and was interested in thinking about how we might start to visualize what's happening in this paper and what oftentimes looks like a graph such as this. So I started working on a project where I imagined a scenario where we might actually have to deal with issues of heightened depression, these much more common natural disasters, and at the same time, synthetic biology may be moving forward to the point where we're able to modify more complex organisms, and proposed this device. This is a vector hatchery, and this would be used in future scenarios where we need to get a constant dosage of serotonin into the bloodstream to keep our positivity up. We might be able to do something like modify a hive of mosquitoes that constantly secrete serotonin as they suck blood from a human host. And so we would actually have this symbiotic relationship with the mosquitoes in our home, this symbiotic household of sorts. So I thought this was an interesting starting point, and I was invited to exhibit this in France at the Design Biennale in Saint-Étienne. And so I took this object to France, but I also started to develop a series of other propositions that might start to play off of this same language of relationship with a synthetically modified organism. So these are a few cells from an animation. I'll just play a little bit of this animation.
As the climate on Earth goes through some changes, we'll want to be prepared in order to continue living comfortable and enjoyable lifestyles far into the future. Thanks to developing science and technology, we'll be able to maintain our present quality of life with only minor adjustments. The following 7 scenarios demonstrate how we could meet some of these evolving needs by hosting specially engineered organisms, a low-cost, low-energy solution for our lifestyle changes. 1. Increasingly frequent natural disasters may make mental depression more common. Inside this hatchery, genetically altered mosquito colonies make mood stabilizers, which can be delivered directly into one's bloodstream through a permeable mesh. 2. Intermittent electricity delivery may become unavoidable. When blackouts occur, the bioluminescent ants in this hatchery offer safety lighting until power becomes available. 3. Depleted nutrients in the Earth's crust may make home farming difficult. Phosphorus-seeking dung beetles will help locate more fertile soil. 4. To cope with drastic seasonal weather fluctuations, slugs with foaming mucus offer variable degrees of home insulation throughout the year. 5. Energy leaks may be too costly to allow. Invisible electricity usage may be indicated by electromagnetically attracted models. 6. Hazardous outdoor conditions like extreme heat, ozone, and dangerous UV light will require us to stay inside on certain days. In this scenario, hazardous conditions are signaled by color-indicating butterflies that come into the home, letting us know whether it's safe to go out. And 7. As food shipment over long distances becomes prohibitively expensive, flavor-augmented insects can be cultivated as supplements. It's nice to know that we can look forward to a bright future made possible by technological solutions. Soon, we'll all be living in our own symbiotic households.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek tone there, and I apologize that it's quiet. I'm not sure if I have any more power over the volume knob than what was displayed there. So I think in a number of these cases, there's some potential interesting conversations that start to take place. A lot of this work that operates in the canon of a number of pioneering speculative design projects are projects that are done by designers, maybe in collaboration with a researcher, or oftentimes in response to the work being done by a researcher. And then it's just kind of put out for the world to look at, maybe kind of scratch their head and say, okay, that's interesting, but now what? And so I think that framing of speculative design had kind of challenged me as I was working in this domain. And I was really interested in thinking about how the notion of design for conversation can be pursued more actively. And so I launched a practice about 6 years ago with a collaborator, Chris Wolfkin, called the Extrapolation Factory. And the Extrapolation Factory takes on this mission of democratizing design futures practices. And so we've been working on setting up workshops in spaces where folks who are non-futurists, but other than that have interesting insights into the world and very specific personal visions may be able to provide alternative versions of possible future narratives that we can reflect on and truly converse about in a designated forum, as opposed to kind of putting these things out into the blogosphere and just letting them percolate. So I'll show two projects. The first one, very briefly, is one of the earliest projects that we did. It's called 99-cent Futures. We're very interested in the dollar store as a social phenomenon, and we've almost all walked into a dollar store at some point in time. My collaborator and I found dollar stores interesting partly because of the range of things that you can find in the dollar store. So in a 99-cent store, you can find objects that were invented maybe 3,000 years ago, the toothpick, all the way up to things that look like they really fit in the 1950s, some kind of something from the 80s, maybe this package of stickers that fits perfectly on a VHS cassette, a car tape adapter that you can still buy in a dollar store, although I don't know anyone who has a car tape adapter, all the way up to the latest iPhone cover with holographic kittens. And so as you walk through the aisle of the dollar store, you're almost doing this kind of imagination-based time travel, right? You're seeing these things from a history of humanity. And if that's the case, it might not be too much of a stretch to start to imagine that next object that lives in the future also on the same shelf. So we took that premise and we challenged a group of about 40 folks at Columbia University in New York City to imagine the items that you would find in a dollar store. We walked them through a very simplified 4-step process that mirrored some of the work that happens in think tanks focused on future studies. We asked them to reflect on a handful of signals and predictions for how the future might shape up. We asked them to then imagine the likelihood of those futures from their subjective perspective. Is this a probable or an impossible future, or somewhere in between? And then we asked them to imagine where this sits in the world in regard to it being a more socially impactful or technologically impactful, ecologically, economic, or politically impactful signal, and then to write a short story about how this might start to play into the world. We asked them to challenge these signals if they felt that the signals proposed a future that they weren't excited about, or to offer an alternative. And so we, in the end of the workshop, had people take their ideas, their stories, and try to distill them down into physical objects that were cobbled together with hot glue guns and found objects. Very simple prototyping exercise, really. And then a packaging template that we had put together. And we got things like this. So when you look at this, we're hoping that you don't see the dental tool, the toe separator for the pedicure, the eyelash curler, and the flashlight, but rather a currency converter from the future. And this currency converter might be useful in a scenario where when you walk into the local corner store to buy a pack of gum, you might pay in US dollars and you might get rupees back, or you might get pesos back. You might even get a currency back that we're not yet using. That might be a local community currency in a certain area. One of the signals that was used to inspire this one had to do with the idea that cacao shortages might actually trigger the use of cacao beans as a currency. And so maybe you would be able to test the cacao bean and make sure that it was worth the change that you were getting from the pack of gum. There were quite a number of pieces that came out of this workshop. Here are a few more. The one in the upper right is maybe interesting for this crew. This is the Tripa Critter. This is kind of a play-based kit for building your own synthetic life form while you're tripping on LSD, which is, I know it solicits giggles, but this is actually kind of based on the evolution of legalization of certain drugs. We all know that LSD was once legal and it was used in research by the US government. We're seeing shifts toward the potential legalization of marijuana and certain other drugs. So 20 years down the road, at the point where synthetic biology becomes a plaything, could LSD also be legal? If so, the confluence of those two evolutions could yield a product like this. How do we feel about that? So we ended up with a little over 30 individual ideas manifested as these kind of prop-like physical objects that help to tell stories of possible futures. None of these were provided by us. They weren't our visions of the future. This was a collective group of projects that were developed by these participants who came to the workshop that we had designed. So we took these and replicated them. We had almost 100 items, and we partnered with a dollar store in downtown Brooklyn and stocked these items in their dollar store. So you could walk through the dollar store and see a pack of knockoff Band-Aids and maybe some fake Neosporin sitting next to this home transplant kit. And you know, this transplant kit doesn't come with the organ included, as it says on the back. But you can, for 99 cents, buy the home transplant kit and go off and think about whether you like this idea or not. So we actually sold everything in the dollar store for 99 cents. The proceeds went back to the owners of the dollar store. And for us, it was really an opportunity to engage in these conversations again in the forum of the dollar store, where we take for granted the genuine proposition that is claimed on the title of the object, right? So if you buy a dog leash, you assume that it is for real dogs going on real walks in the real world. Same with this. You kind of see this and you have this moment of suspension of disbelief where you think to yourself, wait, is this really for doing home transplants? And then obviously on the back it kind of reveals what's happening. It's not meant to be a gag, but rather a tool to allow you to come along for this fictional journey so that you can start to imagine it yourself. One of the things that we also really like about getting out of the gallery space and getting into these contexts of commerce is that when you go and buy any object, let's say you're buying a shirt, you go through this very instantaneous process where you process a number of futures for yourself. You imagine, could I wear this shirt out to dinner? Could I wear it to a job interview? Could I wear it on a date? Could I wear it to the funeral? And each of these are futures that you're using to help you to assess the viability of this shirt and the value of this shirt. And so in the same way, if we can start to imagine that process with a fictional object like this, we might start to be able to evaluate propositions of futures in more realistic ways than when we do so through kind of a analysis of a graph, let's say, or a paper. So there were, yeah?
Did you track the actual total sales and which objects sold faster and things like that?
We didn't track which objects sold faster, but they all sold. So that was interesting. We had the store open as it's shown here just for a day. So we had kind of nestled things into the rest of the inventory of the store, but everything sold. I think anecdotally I can say that there were certain things that sold to certain people because they were already invested in that idea. So for example, I know one person who came in was a teacher and they bought something that was an overnight algebra lesson. You could plug this thing in your ear and wake up the next morning being an algebra expert, which sounds kind of weird and concocted, but Nicholas Negroponte has predicted that in the next 30 years we're going to be able to take pills to learn certain types of information. So, and he's had a pretty good track record so far, so let's see what happens. But to speak a little bit more to that, I guess, the home transplant kit is one that I remember distinctly a conversation about. There was a woman who bought the home transplant kit, and after she paid the $1.08 after tax, we walked up to her and said, "So why'd you buy this thing? You know it's fake. It's not really going to do a transplant for you." And she said, "Well, I don't know what I think about this idea, but my son's a doctor, and there's a possibility that he could actually start to turn this thing into a reality." Maybe he's a very sophisticated doctor. I'm not sure about that. But the idea that this fictional proposition went from the mind of a layperson interpreting some data into this physical fake prop, into a store, into the hands of a woman who would then pass it on to her son, who's a doctor, who might be able to slowly push toward future A versus B versus C, is a really interesting way to start to see a conversation develop over time. So the store ended up, we sold everything that was there, and it started to inform a style of work that we've been doing, which we think of as democratized design futures, where we start to shape these conversations and listen for the things that end up being really interesting, and then trying to build them back into more conversations that we frame. So here's the storefront itself. We really left it mostly as is, but we made a couple augmentations. This black banner at the top suggests some of the things you might be able to find in this store. And then we made a small augmentation at the upper right, this green neon sign that says "Cash for DNA." The owners of the store were really gracious, and it was a family-run pharmacy 99-cent store. At the end of the evening when we put this project on, they said, "This was great, but can you take the sign out of the window, because we're worried that our patrons will actually come in and ask for cash for their DNA." So I'm going to show one last project, and then we'll wrap up, and maybe we can do some Q&A. This is a project that I did with my collaborator, again, Chris Wobkin, recently at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. We had the pleasure of working with the design director there, who's actually a graduate of NC State School of Design, Emmett Burton. Very cool to see New York folks, the North Carolina folks making their way into interesting spaces in art and design around the nation. So the Walker Art Center was in the process of relaunching their facade and their sculpture garden, and they invited us to come in and shape a conversational democratized design futures experience where we could start to have conversations about our relationships to the environment in new ways, potentially new ways. And so we set up a very kind of quick 4-day experience where we invited participants who are walking into, or visitors who are walking into the museum, to become participants and to imagine ways that we might augment our infrastructure around our cities to work symbiotically. So they serve not only human needs, but also non-human needs. We built this 5-foot by 8-foot map of the local area that you saw in the slide before. This glowing bright spot is the Walker Art Center, but then these are parks and highways and all sorts of other urban infrastructure that surround the museum. And we asked folks to imagine the pieces of the infrastructure that are already out there, and then to think about how they might be slightly twisted or tweaked. They would build these small architectural models and place them on the map and tell a short story about how they came up with the idea. We also shared a list of local species, some indigenous, some invasive, that are around that they might think about either catering to or kind of reconsidering the relationship to. So this is an image of that map that we generated with them. We're really interested in then taking these ideas that were generated by non-experts, let's say, and bringing them into a form where we had a much more expert view on the issue. And so we took the ideas that were generated at the museum to UMN's School of Ecology, and we worked with a group of ecologists and biologists, PhD candidates, PhDs, etc., to evaluate the propositions that had come through. And then also to kind of go through this same brainstorm exercise again. And so there were, of course, a bunch of recommendations from the public that ended up kind of getting pushed to the edges of the table, but there were a few really interesting ideas that were maintained. One of the key pieces that the ecologists and biologists in this room liked was this notion that we could start to build more effective communication channels between ourselves and non-humans. And there were a number of possible ways to do this, but one of the pieces of infrastructure that seemed to rise to the top was the US Postal Service mailbox, the iconic blue mailbox with the domed top. And so in this workshop, we started sketching out variations on the US Postal Service mailbox. And so here are just a handful of them. Each one of these is redesigned to help us communicate with an indicator species. So I won't list through all of these, but we'll get back to some of these. But some of these have to do with listening to the arrival, departure patterns of migratory birds as a way to track phenology, the movement of seasons, possibly listening to, I think this was for bats. This is a bat house, a crow conversation point, a salamander mailbox. So we started thinking about how we might bring some of these propositions that have been developed collaboratively between a group of members of the public and researchers at the university to life. And we started out by saying, well, maybe we can just buy some mailboxes and augment them. And it turns out that you can, in fact, buy US Postal Service mailboxes on eBay. They're quite expensive. It also turns out, according to the US Postal Service, that that's very illegal. You can't do that. So I don't know what happened to that person who's selling a mailbox. So we kept searching. We found in a forum that you can actually find the US Postal Service mailbox manufacturer's website. And so we went there, and they actually sell kind of blank versions of the US Postal Service mailbox, and you can get it in any color but blue, so that it doesn't deceive the public. And so this felt like a turning point for us. We went ahead and bought several mailboxes and then worked with a fabricator to take some of these ideas that had been generated by our collaborators and bring them to life and bring them back to the Walker Art Center. So we settled on 3 mailbox designs. The first one is the Leica mailbox. So this mailbox has a 400-pound boulder underneath it and a time-lapse camera that's facing down onto the boulder. The boulder is covered in lichen, and it's tracking the growth of the lichen over time. So in theory, if you had these mailboxes scattered around a city, you would be able to watch the lichen grow in different parts of the city. Lichen is a very good indicator of air quality. And so you might start to, in a citizen science manner, be able to observe the air quality with your eyes by walking around the city and seeing where the lichen is looking rich and very diverse, and where the lichen is dying off. The second one is the Pollinator Mailbox. So again, kind of looking at indicator species that were recommended to us by our research friends. We were interested in thinking about how we might start to track the transformations of butterfly torsos as they are exposed to toxins and pollutants in the atmosphere. And so if we were able to set up a kind of a camera trap, a motion sensing camera and a fake nectar of sorts, butterflies might land on this fake flower, have their photo taken, and over time with a simple AI we would be able to compare the body shapes of these butterflies and start to look for increases or decreases in pollutants in the atmosphere around. And then the third one, I mentioned it earlier in some of these sketches, this is the migratory bird mailbox. And so we ended up really focusing in on warblers specifically, but this mailbox has a handful of birdhouses in the bottom just as a gesture, kind gesture to the warblers. But what's most important about this one is that it's got a long-range microphone and it's listening for specific bird sounds. And so with a relatively simple AI, it's able to discern one bird sound from another and listen for a bird sound at the beginning of each season. The first time it hears the warbler sound, and then the last time it hears the warbler sound. So again, if we had mailboxes like these distributed around our cities, we would be able to start to track the shifts in migratory patterns, which relate to oftentimes the shifts in climate by listening for the bird calls. So this is something that birders are already doing, right? They're out looking for the first sighting of a certain bird. We know spring has come when robins are here, but this might be a more thorough way to do it. So lastly, we imagined that these mailboxes could still perform their functions as U.S. Postal Service mailboxes. We set up an interspecies post office in the middle of the Walker's sculpture garden. This is a temporary structure. The others are actually permanent, and you can still go to Minneapolis, to 3 different points in Minneapolis, and go see the mailboxes. But while this was set up, we invited visitors to the museum to imagine the types of messages that these species would want to send to their political representatives, our political representatives, and then to write a postcard on behalf of one of these species. So, you know, what would a lichen say to Al Franken when he was in office? Or what would a lichen say to any other local representative in Minneapolis? And so let's show this. These are just a few shots from the Interspecies Postal Service. People would watch footage from each of the mailboxes, write a short letter, and then go and mail their messages to one of the politicians. We stamped them and actually sent almost 2,000 postcards to local representatives on behalf of these 3 species. Okay. This is the post office itself, and here are a few of the letters that were written. So I'll end there. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you have to run during the Q&A, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to chat going forward. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, we got about 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Good that I'm going first. I have praise, an observation, a question, and a proposition.
Okay.
I'll save the proposition for after.
All right.
The praise is that, and the observation are that you use humor as a really powerful tool in these interventions, and I think that's remarkable and worth remembering for all of us. That humor is it's a very interesting way of approaching the future, because the future is often terrifying, out of our control. And humor is an ancient technique for dealing with uncertainty that you have adopted here, and I think in a really creative way. And then the observation, or the question is that the environmental historian Bill Cronin has said that the future is not what it used to be. There's variations of this from other people, but his is based on studying different futures past that people have proposed. And he's noticed this trend toward more and more negative, and also smaller futures. Futures that just aren't as interesting from a human perspective. And so the question is, are you finding this yourself, and is your goal to make those futures bigger?
That's a great question. I don't think that I have a data set that would be that would reveal that. I've been doing this stuff for 6 years as a practice through the Extrapolation Factory, and more like 10 years as an independent practitioner. I do think that in my personal experience as a human, I think that there's a transition from futures that feel like dreams to futures that feel like hopes. And I'm borrowing that language from Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who wrote a book called Speculative Everything. But yeah, I think we do oftentimes in our social discourse talk about things that we hope happen. We hope that we can solve, the poverty problem, or the problems with malnutrition, but we don't talk about dreams in as such as we provide specific details to the visions of what it looks like when we deal with any one of these issues. So I think that's definitely happening. I think it would be interesting to talk to folks who are older than I am I really enjoy conversations with seniors. You know, an octogenarian has a very different perspective on how future narratives have changed, and I'm roughly half that age. I have half that experience. So I think age, kind of age diversity is a really critical piece when we talk about futures, for sure.
Yeah, a lot of fun, and I don't think anybody in this room is nearly as creative as what we've just seen. Democratization and kind of not knowing your academic world, your social world. Couldn't help but notice that you went from the New School to Columbia to Walker Art, and these are not necessarily economically diverse places. So, like, what are the next democratization steps that you see even available to you to kind of branch out a little bit?
Sure. That's a great point, and it's a really challenging piece in all of the work that I've been attempting to do. One of the constraints, as you guys probably all face as well, is funding. The Walker reached out and said, hey, we have this opportunity, we have some funding to do this project. The Walker, although it's not as diverse as it could be, it is impressively diverse for an institution of its kind. Columbia, yeah. Point taken. We've also done projects through the Extrapolation Factory with public schools in Bushwick in Brooklyn, with groups that are not necessarily diverse, but have very different backgrounds than we do. And when I say diverse, they are mostly Black and Latino young students, roughly 10 years old. And so within their groups, there's you know, a homogeneity, but it's different than the all-white, oftentimes all-white male homogeneity that you find in spaces like politics or the rest of, you know, America's, like, you know, power structures, unfortunately. We've also done a project a while back where we worked to bring a format like this into a context that was completely stochastic, or as stochastic as we could make it, which was to run a futures workshop on a street corner in Lower Manhattan. And so we literally pasted up some of the same materials that we had used at Columbia on the side of a building and invited anybody who walked by to take part in this process. And so that was a really nice opportunity for us to say, we don't know who's gonna come, everybody is welcome, and if they have 2 minutes to go through this thought process, we will engage them and talk to them about it. There have been a number of projects that we've done in our past that, as a practice, have started to work toward this. But it's a real challenge, and it's not an easy one to overcome, particularly because of the funding issue. We also have to pay rent, and the folks who oftentimes have money to pay us to do projects are coming from a certain position of privilege. So. Yeah, there's not an easy answer.
I can jump in line with the proposition.
Okay. Yeah.
So give them some credit, they did go to the dollar store.
Oh no, I saw that. I totally saw that. Yeah, yeah.
But so Elliott, one of your earlier slides had a horizontal dimension from constraint to
yes.
Freedom, unconstrained experiment, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's like a really crucial dialectic in your project. So. People can come up with a really original idea, but next thing you know, somebody is saying, "Oh, that won't work," or you have the laws of nature that prohibit you from doing this, right? Yes. Yeah. Or you have social or ethical constraints, or the transplant thing has to be approved by the FDA.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, where this may be how I think, but the conversation almost immediately goes to questions of constraint, and that's where the action is in terms of playing out these futures. So I guess first I'd like to hear how you see that dynamic as part of your work, and then whose job is it to address that? Should the designer work through some of that before you propose a product? Or you want to get the product out there as unconstrained as possible and then see how people raise the constraints for conversation?
Sure. I think that's a really well taken point. as I was speaking earlier, I referenced Cameron Tonkin-Wise as he says that art is omnivorous. And I think what he means there is that art is absolutely unconstrained. And so, you know, anything that you want to be art can be art. And your art might be different than your art, right? And so we have this almost complete lack of constraint.
Not all art theorists would agree with that, though.
Maybe not all art theorists, but if you go to an art classroom at a primary school, you're going to get a very different take on art than if you talk to the art theorist. So I think art is this really wide open and pretty messy territory. And if you go to the other end of things, if you go to, you know, a policy think tank, the amount of constraint that's happening there is really focused in. And so I think as speculative designers, being able to move between these areas of lack of constraint and constraint is a really valuable flexibility. I think as a speculative designer, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to propose concepts that resonate with folks who operate in spaces of constraint. I'm not just trying to speak to artists. And I want these ideas to catch, to be stimulating or provocative to folks who operate in spaces of constraint. But at the same time, I want to be able to borrow the unconstrained practices from spaces like art and these more free-form design territories. Because I think oftentimes we get so locked into our worlds of constraint, you know, this cone diagram where we think we know what is possible and what's not possible. And as you mentioned, some of those barriers are social barriers. So the only reason that we all think that it is 2 minutes to 1 is because we've all agreed with a set of social terms that it's 2 minutes to 1. And we might all just decide to change our mind one day and say, we're going to use different time formats, which we all did 200 years ago. So I don't know if that completely answers that question, but I think the speculative designer needs to be able to operate between the two to be relevant in both cases.
As a science fiction fan, addict, I've been reading science fiction a long time, so I saw it up on your constrained to unconstrained chart. And in science fiction, we've got the variety of hard science fiction and fantasy, where it's got exactly that same art dimension you were talking about. And that got me thinking about entrepreneurship, where a lot of developing new products is ignoring traditional constraints. And we actually have a project on campus, the Entrepreneurship Garage, I don't know if anybody knows about that, where students are encouraged to come up with innovative projects. And I'm sitting here sort of, editing your presentation as you go, thinking about how it fits into that entrepreneurship dimension, as while you're looking at, I view you as looking at more as art, but I'm seeing that, and as soon as you get into the entrepreneurship, the discussion you just had is, at the beginning there's constraints, as you progress there are other constraints, but a lot of it is ignoring traditional constraints.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A quick anecdote. We ran a project in Belgium with a design group out there, and one of the participants at this workshop was an innovation officer at a major telecom company in Europe. And at the end of the workshop, we were sitting down with him for a drink, and we said, so in your line of work, how do you measure success? And he said, oh, well, we just count the number of patents that we could apply for at the end of the day. And we said, okay. So we went through a project like this. We said, how many patents do you think we've got here? And he said, about 11. And there were 12 projects. And so he was saying, you've probably got something interesting in every one of these. Whether it goes on to become an actual product is another story. Yeah, here and then. Okay.
Yeah, so I just have a question, comment. I really appreciated the 99-cent futures thing. And the LSD one, I laughed at because one of the most probably important advances in molecular biology in the last 50 years was discovered or invented, depending on your point of view, by a researcher who was tripping on LSD.
Okay.
So, you presented it in a different frame, so that's how I said it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I've led a couple of workshops that were sort of like very first form efforts at these kinds of workshops, and one was for practitioners. I'm a librarian, so kind of walked a bunch of librarians through thinking of what's the future of our profession, you know, looking into the future. And then I've done a few with undergraduate courses where we've looked at kind of the near future of how technology reframes library services, again, with students focusing on that. And so I'm more wondering about like the structure of these activities that you bring people into. What are some rules of thumb? How do you bring serious research into the context of what's a workshop, often probably time constrained, and people who aren't experts in those fields? Like, how do you set the stage for people to come into a space, really engage with these kind of big ideas and trends, and then to also still have a space where they can be critical and creative?
Yeah,
I think
that's a great point. Two quick approaches that I'll suggest now, and then we can maybe talk more afterwards. One is the practice of signal scanning, which is done pretty widely in the future studies community. We oftentimes will prepare signal databases for the participants in our workshops because there's just not enough time for them to do a proper signal scan activity. But signal scanning is, in essence, kind of the act of looking at the emergence of new events, new activities that feel like they may be the first of their kind to do something, but have the potential to disrupt at a much larger scale, either bigger disruptions or to happen more broadly across a geographic space or a population. So we do a lot of searching for weak signals in the space of future studies. In the workshops that I run, I bring this attention to signals into the beginning of almost all of the workshops to kind of get people thinking about the transformations that are happening now that are just starting to show their heads, that we might be able to extrapolate into bigger, more interesting, innovative, problematic, disruptive transformations. The second tool that we oftentimes use is the STEEP model, and I referenced it in passing in the 99-cent Futures workshop. But the STEEP model of analysis is a way for us to look at the types of data that are coming into our review of change, and to ensure that we're looking at the data in a comprehensive manner. And so oftentimes in the spaces of science fiction and many times in Hollywood futures, we end up with these very technologically heavy versions of futures. When we talk about futures in the world of business today, it usually takes about 38 seconds before Elon Musk's name is mentioned. So we have a lot of focus on technology, and I think it's important for us to be able to spread our view out to the ecological transformations, the social transformations, the political transformations. We actually have a lot of political conversation now too, and the economic transformations that are happening. I recently led a workshop with a group of executives in education who were thinking about the future of schools, but I asked them to bring signals with them, and then we analyzed the signals in these broad categories, and the one space that nobody was thinking about was the economic, which is shocking for a bunch of folks who are at that level. But there are a bunch of other tools that are coming from future studies spaces, and we can't necessarily use every one in every workshop that we run, but usually there's a way to at least talk about the rigor that is used in a more serious future studies operation, and then help these folks think about how they might engage with one or two tools in the workshop itself.
Thank you.
All right, let's thank Elliott. Elliott's going to be leading the Thursday discussion.
Yes.
Come again for that. He's also going to be here for the next couple of days, and I believe still has some slots open.
Yes.
Potentially, so if you'd like to meet with them, come talk to me, Sharon, or Elliott just directly.
Sure.
Thanks again.
Wonderful.